All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our symposium honoring Roy Shephard. As I was just saying, Roy was a figure in the field of human biology, biological anthropology, as well as ancillary type fields, which intersect with the work that we do. And his career spanned 6 decades, and he had a major influence on the field of exercise science and public health. And he did a lot of work in human biology, and that's why we wanted to honor him today and to present some of that early work, because a lot of that early work has had ripple effects throughout our entire organization and our entire field of human biology. So we have a session with two speakers, myself, Peter Katz-Marzik. I'm from the Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I've been a long-time member of the HBA. My first meeting was in 1992, I believe, in Toronto, along with the AAPA meetings back then, and I've been a member ever since. And working with Dr. Bill Leonard, who's here as well, who you all know. And we've spent some time together working on circumpolar health, as he will describe in his presentation. So I'd like to start by just honoring the legacy of Roy Shephard. Roy Shephard was originally from the UK. He obtained his academic education there. Here's a picture of him in 1953, graduating from London University with his MBBS degree, followed up with a PhD and an MD after that. And all of these studies occurred in the UK. And he came across the pond in 1964 to Canada. And I didn't know this until Bill Leonard was in touch with the family and received some photos. But he came to North America on the Queen Mary in 1964. He, like most good British spies, he traveled on the Queen Mary. And he does actually look like James Bond in his earlier days, I think. He took up his position, rose through the ranks at the University of Toronto, in Toronto, Canada, from 1964 through 1994. He held a number of leadership positions there related to fitness, physical activity, and health, and he became emeritus in 1994. He was actually the director of the School of Physical and Health Education from 1979 through 1991. And he's a well-known figure in Toronto, in academia in Canada, and around the world. And I want to show a little bit of the numbers, a little bit of some highlights of his career, just to set the stage for you. So Roy was very prolific. He published about 2,000 peer-reviewed papers, more than 100 books. And many of these books are just seminal, contributions to the literature. And these are entire books written by him. He had a few edited volumes, but a lot of them were single-authored books. He mentored dozens and dozens of students and faculty who have gone around the world now. And importantly, I wanted to mention, and I'll highlight, he's hosted several international conferences in Toronto, which were extremely influential in the field. This is a picture of Roy Shephard with his colleague, Ira Jacobs, who is now the dean of the school in University of Toronto. And this is the Toronto Varsity Blues hockey team. And this is when Roy went back for one of the games. Now, when I say he was prolific, 2,000 peer-reviewed papers, he was constantly writing. That was his hallmark. He was constantly writing. You would see him on the subway in Toronto going to work, and he'd be sitting there writing a paper. These were the days in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, before we had computers, before we had electronic publishing. So he was writing these papers in longhand. He'd write a sentence, this paper by Bill Leonard was just a gem. And then he'd say, Leonard et al., American Journal of Human Biology, 1992, and he'd put even the page numbers in there. And then he'd move on to the next one and the next one. And he would write all this out, and his secretary would type up his papers. And, some people think he had like a photographic memory, but it was really a bibliographic memory, I think. He just knew the literature so well. He knew the page numbers of all the great papers, and he would just be able to sit there and write papers on the subway. And by the time he got to work, he'd have a paper to hand in to his secretary. Just unbelievable individual. And I wanted to highlight this a little bit um, because, we're all here because of people who have gone before us in the field. And they say that we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And this is true with Roy in every respect. And I'd like to add that he was also a very, very humble man. He was the humblest person you would ever know, and he was extremely kind. And I'll just show this for a couple of reasons. One, this is where he obtained his academic credentials. This is when he came to Canada in 1964. And then, of course, he had a steady rise in publications that continued throughout his career. And when we say career, if you're around my age, mid 50s into the 60s, this is when we start thinking about retirement, slowing down a little bit, in this age here. But look at the career he had right up until his death. He died at the age of 93 in the year 2003. He was just a few days shy of his 94th birthday. And I wanted just to highlight that, there was no slowing down for him. Like, even though he left here from University of Toronto when he actually retired, just look at his remaining career. Just an outstanding individual, made so many great contributions to science, and he just never slowed down. So it's just truly a remarkable individual. And here I just thought I'd put in, this is the Human Biology Council, 1974, when it was established. And so we thought it was very nice maybe to have the symposium this year when we honor our 50th year as an organization, to also kind of look back in time at some of the leaders in our field. So Roy is certainly that. And one thing which he has, which is just incredible, he is a member of the Order of Canada, which was bestowed upon him in 2014. This is the highest honor that a Canadian can receive. The only other person I know who's still living in academia who has that same honor is Dr. Claude Bouchard. And many of you may know Dr. Claude Bouchard. He was very active in the Human Biology Association, and he worked in the field of anthropological genetics, receiving his degree from University of Texas in Austin. So it's an extreme honor to have him with this award. And in addition to all this writing and mentoring and publishing, he was very active in the global community. And he didn't waste any time when he got to Canada. This is a seminal conference here, International Symposium on Physical Activity and Cardiovascular Health, which Roy organized in 1966 in Toronto. So just 2 years after he arrived, he's already organizing this major international conference. And this is the proceedings, which were published in the Canadian Journal of Canadian Medical Association Journal. And then he went on with Claude Bouchard and others to work on these international conferences, which are all held in Toronto and the surrounding area, which brought together all the experts from around the world on physical activity and health and moving the field forward. And again, he really made time for all of these collaborations in his time. And just a few things, these fields tend to bleed over, which is one of the points I wanted to make today. He was active in the field of physical activity and health and public health and human biology. And we use a lot of his tools still today. This is the Godin-Shephard questionnaire, which he published with Gaston Godin. It's a simple method, as they say, to assess exercise behavior in the community. This questionnaire is used in human biology all the time. As a matter of fact, I'm still using it today. We're just starting a new cohort study at Pennington, and this is one of the questionnaires we have. It's a simple questionnaire, as you see here. It asks you about strenuous, moderate, and light activity throughout the week. And so that is something that still ripples forward today. Another thing which we all use is the PAR-Q. You may have heard of the PAR-Q. It was developed originally in Canada. David Chisholm back in British Columbia in the 1960s and early 70s. And it was, here's a paper by Roy Shephard with Scott Thomas, one of his mentees, where they revised it because there were a few issues with the original PAR-Q because it was eliminating too many older individuals from physical activity. So as you might know, the PAR-Q is designed to assess your readiness to undertake physical activity. So before you do a fitness test in a gym, they may give you the PAR-Q to fill out, or before you join a cardiac rehab program or these sorts of things. And it's designed to be exclusionary, that if you answer yes to one of the 7 questions, you should see a doctor before undertaking activity. And this has been used now for decades in the international environment. We have a number of PARQs out there now. There's a PARQ MedX, there's one for pregnancy and others. And he really drove the PARQ and all of its subsequent revisions. The other big thing, which we use a lot, is the Canadian Home Fitness Test. And what this was, it was designed as a set of steps, and they would send these CDs out. And this is for males, there's one for females, and it was tempo, like up 2, 3, down 2, 3, up 2, 3, down 2, 3. And you could undertake this fitness test and take your heart rate at each session, at the end of each session, and it would predict your aerobic capacity. This was used in the Canadian Fitness Survey. It was a survey of 23,000 Canadians in 1981, and it's been used all around the world. It's changed names over the time because home fitness test didn't really have a real strong scientific vibe to it. So now it's called the Canadian Standardized Test of Fitness. And this was all developed by Roy Shephard. And so just before I move into the human biology section, he was very, very active in these Canadian physical activity guidelines, public health guidelines. He would translate all of the science and bring it forward into public health guidelines for the good of the public. And there's a couple of pictures from 2007 and 2009. These are in Kananaskis, Alberta, very close to where he was living because he couldn't fly across the country anymore. Here's a picture of Roy here, center, and here he is just peeking out here in an outside picture. And so he was very, very active in developing these very, very forward-thinking physical activity guidelines for the population. And I wanted to mention, because you mentioned Zoom, that I think Roy gave one of the very first virtual talks back in the day here, because he couldn't travel to one of our meetings. So what he did was he actually took a tape recorder, the old audio tapes, and he taped himself giving the presentation, and he mailed that, it wasn't a videotape, it was an audio tape, mailed it to the organizers, and he had his slides, and there was someone up the front holding the tape recorder here at the microphone, and Roy gave his presentation. So that was my first experience on a virtual type presentation. Some people said it was the best talk he ever gave. So yeah, a real character there. I also heard he made a mean mixtape as well, so I don't know about that. So with that, I kind of give you that background on the physiologist, on the public health expert, to introduce his work in the International Biological Program, which was very centered in human biology. The Human Adaptability Project was one of the key topic areas in the IBP, ran from 1964 to 74, and the IBP and HAP was really on looking at the effects of changes in the natural environment and its impact on human health. A big part of this was understanding physiological work capacity and energy expenditure patterns in isolated Indigenous populations. And I know for sure that the program in Siberia, which Bill Leonard ran with Mike Crawford and Rem Sekurnik, was very much, a play on this in the future. And it's really had a huge impact on human biology. In fact, Dr. Roy Shephard was the director of the IBP expert group on measuring physiological work capacity. And this was one of their publications from IBP, where he was the chair. And this book really set the stage and set the standards for the measurement of VO2 peak, VO2 max, and physiological work capacity in all around the world. And it was adopted by many human biologists. And in addition to being the chair of that committee, he was also one of the PIs at one of the sites in the IBP. And so there were 3 circumpolar communities which were selected for studies. One was in Igloolik in the Northwest Territories of Canada. That's where he did his work with a fellow named Andrus Road. You may have heard of that, Road and Shepherd, or Shepherd and Road, and all the publications. And there were other sites, of course, in Alaska and Greenland. I'd like to just introduce a little bit about that site in Igloolik. Here is a map of Canada, still up to date. This and it's funny that this was an old slide from the late 1970s, and they had to put this disclaimer in. It's designed to show only the relative location and size of Canada's Northwest Territories and a few representative communities. I mean, I thought that was the purpose of a map, but they had to put that on there. So here's Igloolik way up north. Here is Toronto, where University of Toronto was, where Roy Shephard was. And this is with the site in Igloolik, where he worked with Andrus Road. This is a photograph of the site in the late 1970s. You can see it's very remote, very desolate. And in Canada, we have many of these communities which don't look much different today, and they're strewn across the northern part of our country. Now, I chose to show this photograph. I thought it was interesting because I think it shows the transition which was occurring in Igloolik at this time. And these are seal hunters. And here's a traditional hunter here with his spear. You know, they used to have a hole in the ice, and when the seals would come up to breathe, then they would spear them. But look at the fellow beside him. He's not taking any chances. He's got a rifle ready to go. So this was a period of transition from kind of more traditional kind of hunting styles to more modern hunting styles. And this is what they were studying. This was the point of the project. And another couple of photos here, which I find interesting. The one on the left is, a traditional kind of sleigh with a bunch of people on here and a bunch of equipment and supplies. But what's interesting, you see the snowmobile. This was a Skidoo Olympic. This was a workhorse of the Canadian North. The Skidoo Olympic, that's probably about a 1968 model. I had one from 1972, which I grew up on. And you can't kill these things. But these snowmobiles were used to haul people and supplies around the north. They replaced dog sleds, essentially. And so this again shows some transition. Another one here of a seal, but also look at the boat behind. It's quite a modern boat with an outboard motor, etc. So this was the time frame where he was studying these transitions that we're all very, very interested in our field. And Bill Leonard is going to pick up on this and talk about some of this work and its translation to the work in Siberia. So I was lucky enough in 1992 to accompany Bill Leonard and Mike Crawford, Rem Sekurnik to Siberia, where we conducted field tests of physical activity and physical fitness among the Evenki and the Quito populations. And here we have a picture of Bill. It looks exactly the same. And he's doing the Canadian Standardized Test of Fitness on a subject here. These are the set of stairs, which we absconded from the University of Guelph Physiology Department. And this was our lab in Siberia. Here's the woodpile, the venerable woodpile. And here we have our oxygen monitor, our dry gas volume meter, our tank of oxygen for calibrating the machines. And so we use the Douglas airbag technique in order to measure oxygen consumption at rest and during exercise, which we subsequently then used to estimate total energy expenditure using the flex heart rate method. And so all of this was portable and it was translated to the field, but it all had a very strong basis in exercise physiology. And the Canadian Home Fitness Test was a central part of that right there. So just a couple more notes on Roy before I turn it over. As I said, he's a very humble individual. These are the first two papers that I ever wrote. These were from our work in Siberia, both published in the American Journal of Human Biology, 1994. And Roy Shephard was one of the reviewers on these two papers. And we knew that because I guess even back in 1994, he was all about open access to reviews. So he would, again, write out, we had handwritten reports of our reviews from Roy Shephard, and he signed all of his reviews. He signed them all and they were mailed back. And then this was the tail end of the, I guess this had just preceded electronic publishing. Because at this time, we had to, type out the papers, make 4 copies or 5 copies, send them to the editor of the journal. they would then send them to the reviewers who would review the papers and send them back to us. So it wasn't like today where you could just go online and do your review. So he was very humble. He really, and in one of my office moves, I lost those reviews and I really wish I had them today. I looked for them about 3 times, but very unique. I had to just show some data here. Bill's going to show much more, but these are the Aglulic Inuit, and this is VO2 max estimated from the step test. These are male hunters, transitional and urbanized, and we could see this kind of reduction in VO2 max. These are the data we had from males and females from Siberia here. And it was this translation, but not only did he have this kind of cross-sectional look at differences in transition, he also established then follow-up studies at 10 years, at 20 years, and he followed these individuals longitudinally for over 20 years for both growth, maturation, fitness, and all that sort of stuff to look at the role of acculturation on the population. So one last thing before I go, I said I was going to tell a couple funny stories about Roy, and this was a funny one. So we were at the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology in 2008, and I'm doing a poster. Across the way from me, Roy Shephard has 2 posters set up. And these are the 2 abstracts from those 2 posters. Now, granted, they're somewhat similar. They're both looking at immune responses. One is comparing children and adults. The other one is immune responses in children treated for cancer. And back in these days, you know, we just didn't print off a poster and go hang it up. We had to print off each individual section on 8.5 by 11 paper, like the methods, the results, and all the figures. And we would glue them onto poster board and then bring them with about 100 tacks, right? And we have to make your poster. So he's across the way from me and he puts up the titles, the methods, but then somehow he got mixed up and he put the results of one study on the other poster and the results of the other study on the other poster. And I didn't notice it at the time, but obviously there's no one at my poster, so I went and looked at his and I'm looking at them and people are kind of puzzled because he had the results from the different posters on the different boards and it was hilarious. Well, it's hilarious from an academic perspective, I guess. You had to be there. You had to be there. So Roy Shephard, again, here's another great photo of him around the time he got his Order of Canada. Just a real humble, great scientist who has had a tremendous impact on the field of human biology, exercise physiology, and public health. And as you look at the American Journal of Human Biology today, you put all this together, and in that journal, these are the expanded scope. This is the expanded aim of the journal, right? To look at public health and human biology. So it's really great to see all of this come full circle. And with that, I really thank you for your attention. And we'll move into Bill's presentation now. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thanks, Peter. I'm really pleased that we're able to recognize Professor Roy Shephard's important contributions to our field on this, our 50th anniversary of the Human Biology Association meetings. As Peter noted, Professor Shephard was a prolific scholar whose work shaped many areas of research. Dr. Shephard was honored with numerous scholarly awards, and in May of 2014, he was appointed to the Order of Canada for his pioneering work in the field of exercise science, and as well for promoting the health benefits of physical activity to Canadians. Yet while Roy Shephard's contributions to the fields of exercise science and public health have been widely recognized, his foundational contributions to human biology and biological anthropology have received somewhat less attention. Indeed, Roy Shephard's work advanced methods for assessing physiological work capacity, body composition in our field. Moreover, as I'll talk about today, his long-term research with the Inuit of the Canadian Arctic has been transformative and continues to shape research on the biology and health of circumpolar populations. As Peter noted, Roy was one of the prime architects of the human adaptability research in the Arctic as part of the International Biological Program, or the IBP. The IBP was initiated in 1964 and ran through 1974. And this work really allowed for us as human biologists to carry out some of the first pioneering work on human adaptability and variation in extreme climates. The Human Adaptability Program promoted a wide range of multidisciplinary research projects around the world. Two of the most widely noted parts of these projects were the study of circumpolar populations and as well the study of high altitude. The research on circumpolar populations in Canada was led by Roy Shephard and his colleagues at the University of Toronto, while the studies in Alaska were led by Bill Laughlin and his team at the University of Wisconsin. The research on the biology of high altitude populations, of course, was carried out by Paul Baker and the Penn State Research Group, studying Quechua populations of the Peruvian Andes. Shephard's initial IBP-sponsored work was conducted in the Arctic community of Igloolik and ran from 1967 to 1974. And here we see some images of Igloolik, courtesy of our colleague Tracy Galloway, who continues to work there. This sort of spaceship-looking like structure is the Igloolik Research Center, and that was the location where much of the research by Shephard and colleagues was carried out. The initial research in Igloolik provided the first comprehensive assessment of physiological adaptability and health among indigenous circumpolar populations. Data collected as part of this research included an anthropometric assessment of growth, body size, and body composition, the measurement of energy expenditure and physical activity levels, the assessment of aerobic capacity and strength, and as well the measurement of general cardiovascular health. After the original IBP research, Shephard and his collaborator Andrus Rode continued to go back to Igloolik in 1979 to 1981, and again with a follow-up study in 1989 to 1990 to document the changes that were ongoing in health with the transition from a subsistence way of life to a more sedentary, market-oriented way of life. Their longitudinal research in Igloolik was summarized in their landmark volume, 1996 book, Health Consequences of Modernization, Evidence from Circumpolar Peoples. I got to know Roy Shephard personally when I was on the faculty at the University of Guelph in the 1990s. Roy was kind and generous, and his input and guidance were very helpful when we were initially setting up our research in Siberia in the 1990s. Indeed, much of our work in Siberia has been modeled after the pioneering work that Shephard and colleagues carried out in Igloolik. In this context, for the remainder of my talk, I'd like to first provide an overview of the major findings and insights from Shephard and colleagues' 20+ years of research in Igloolik. I'll then consider how our own work with Siberian populations has built upon Shephard's contributions to our understanding of the biology and health of circumpolar peoples. This slide highlights some of the major research findings of the initial IBP work done in Igloolik in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They found that traditionally living Inuit had extraordinarily high levels of energy expenditure and physical activity. Additionally, they noted that the Inuit had very high aerobic capacity and physical strength, on par with that of trained athletes. They also documented that Inuit men and women were very lean, despite having relatively high weight to height ratios, or BMIs. And as well, the work documented excellent cardiovascular health, despite consuming diets relatively high in meat and fat. Here we see the results of Godin and Shephard's study of daily energy expenditure and physical activity in the late 60s and early 1970s. Note that Inuit hunters had expenditure levels of almost 3,700 calories a day, with physical activity levels that place them in the vigorous range based on WHO guidelines. In contrast, Inuit villagers had much more modest expenditure and activity levels in the light to moderate range. This slide shows the results of Rode and Shephard's 1971 study comparing maximal aerobic capacity, that is VO2 max, and strength of the Igloolik Inuit to urban Canadian counterparts who were measured in Toronto. As shown in the slide on the left, Across the entire age range, the Inuit and the solid lines had significantly higher aerobic capacities. Additionally, the study also found that Inuit leg strength was fully 50% greater than that of their urban peers. Here we see the results of Shephard and colleagues' 1973 study of body mass and body composition among the Inuit. Body composition in this study was measured using deuterium isotope dilution. Note that while the BMIs approach or exceed the threshold for overweight, that is 25, the adiposity levels are very low, with percent body fat averaging 13% in men and less than 23% in women. These findings are notable because they are among the first to highlight the limitations of weight for height indices such as the BMI in assessing overweight and obesity, a topic that continues to be debated and discussed in public health and medicine today. The IBP era studies in the Arctic communities of North America and Eurasia were all concluded by the mid-1970s. The findings from the different studies were summarized in the landmark 1980 edited volume by F.A. Milan, The Human Biology of Circumpolar Populations. Roy Shephard's chapter in this volume summarized the work in a Glulik. He also concluded the chapter with a clear indication of his future research directions, noting that it will be of great interest to repeat these physiological studies in a few years' time, when circumpolar communities have made further progress towards the urban lifestyle. By the early 1980s, research on adaptability and health among Arctic populations was largely abandoned by human biologists, leaving what Ted Stegman characterized as an unfinished agenda in his 2006 HBA Pearl Memorial Lecture. Roy Shephard and Andrus Rode were among the very few human biologists to continue work in the Arctic, conducting their follow-up work in Igloolik in 1979 to 1981, and again in 1989 to 1990. This work explored the profound health and nutritional consequences of acculturation, lifestyle change, and environmental degradation. As shown here, even by the early 1980s, the research in Igloolik was documenting marked declines in aerobic fitness, increasing body weights and adiposity, and marked declines in strength. The graphs on the left show changes in body weight and sum of three skin folds in Igloolik adults between 1970-71 and 1980-81. On average, men and women gained between 3 and 4 kilograms of weight, while skin fold measures increased by 10 millimeters in men and 15.5 millimeters in women. In the third wave of their research, in 1989 to 1990, Shephard and Rode found further erosions of health and fitness in the Igloolik Inuit. Here we see changes in child and adolescent growth in the Igloolik between 1970 and 1990. There was little evidence of an increased height in secular trend during this time period, whereas in contrast, they found significant increases in both weight and fatness over the 2 decades. Additionally, there were significant declines in aerobic capacity and grip strength. Here, the graphs on the left show the marked increases in the sum of three skin folds, and as well, the sharp declines in grip strength that occurred between 1970 and 1990. Similar results were observed among Igloolik adults. Both men and women showed further declines in aerobic capacity and strength, while showing significant increases in weight and adiposity. Again, the graphs here highlight the dramatic declines in aerobic capacity between 1970 and 1990, contrasted with the dramatic increases in percent body fat over the same time period. With the conclusion of the Igloolik research in the early 1990s, Shephard and Rode offered the following conclusions from their research and recommendations for promoting health and fitness in the community. They noted, quote, "As in many indigenous populations, the loss of traditional physically active lifestyle has led to a rapid deterioration of health-related fitness among the circumpolar Inuit of Igloolik. Further, they go on to say that they believe that a return to traditional patterns of hunting, trapping, and fishing no longer seems a viable option for promoting fitness and health in Igloolik. Rather, they propose that the development of deliberate programs of active leisure in the North as a mechanism to restore health and fitness in these communities. Just as Shephard and Rode were completing their research in Igloolik in the early 90s, we were initiating our work among indigenous Siberian populations. This research has been an international collaboration that has been focused around two main research themes. First, the question of how indigenous Siberians have adapted to their cold and marginal climates. That is, do we find evidence of metabolic responses to these extremes? And additionally, we are interested in how ongoing changes, socioeconomic, in the post-Soviet era of Russia, are influencing the health and well-being of indigenous Siberians. To address these questions, we have worked with several different Siberian populations over the last 30 years, including the Evenki reindeer herders and Ket fishermen of central Siberia, the Buryat cattle herders of the southern Siberian steppes, and since 2003, longitudinal research with the Yakut cattle and horse herders of northeastern Siberia. Our work has employed a wide range of methods, including those used by Shephard and colleagues in the Igloolik work. If you look carefully here, you can see Peter Kaczmarzyk manning the Douglas bag and the dry gas meter in order to measure the volume of expired air. Thankfully, over time, the technology that we've been using has become slightly more advanced and more portable. Our research in Siberia has clearly shown that for both the Igloolik Inuit and indigenous Siberians, there is systematic and significant elevations in basal metabolic rate compared to international reference standards. Here we see the relationship between basal energy expenditure and fat-free mass among the Inuit and Siberian men and women. Note that the solid regression line for the indigenous northern subjects is significantly elevated above the dashed reference line. On average, indigenous men have BMRs that are 18% above predicted levels, whereas women deviate by a positive 20%. This slide shows the individual percent deviations from predicted BMR for each of the indigenous groups compared to non-indigenous individuals living in these same Arctic communities. The indigenous groups have BMRs that are elevated by between 15 and 22%, with each of the groups individually being significantly greater than the 5% elevation we see in non-indigenous subjects. These results suggest that the increased metabolic turnover in indigenous populations may reflect genetic and/or developmental adaptations. Our work has further identified three important pathways for promoting increased metabolic heat production among indigenous Siberians. These include alterations in thyroid function with enhanced uptake of thyroid hormones during the wintertime cold, the identification of significant amounts of active brown adipose tissue, promoting enhanced non-shivering thermogenesis in response to cold, and as well the identification of a distinct set of mutations in the mitochondrial genome that are linked to increased uncoupling and increased metabolic rates. We've also measured total energy expenditure and physical activity level among indigenous Siberians living in more traditional and more urbanized settings. This slide compares total energy expenditure and physical activity among the Igloolik Inuit to those of the Ket, Evenki, and Yakut. Of the Siberian groups, the Evenki living in the small reindeer herding encampments had the highest physical activity levels, in the moderate range, but still well below the physical activity levels documented for Igloolik hunters. The lowest levels of physical activity were seen among the most urbanized Evenki living in the town of Baikit. Intriguingly, as Peter noted in his talk, the estimated aerobic capacities that we found among the Kiet and Evenki in the early 1990s were notably lower than those of the Inuit. This slide compares the VO2 max estimates of the Igloolik adults for all 3 study periods to those of the indigenous Evenki and Kiet. And note that the Evenki and Kiet in the purple are lower than all 3 waves in Igloolik. Our work in Russia has also examined the impacts of social and economic changes in post-Soviet Russia on the health and well-being of indigenous Siberians. By the mid-1990s, many of the indigenous herding and farming cooperatives were dismantled, leading to a shift away from subsistence lifeways to a more market-oriented way of life. Today, most families pursue a mixed economy with some wage employment, along with continued participation in traditional subsistence activities to supplement their diets. We're also finding a marked increase in the availability of Western market foods, even in once isolated rural villages. Here we see some examples of these changes among the Yakut in the Saha Republic. These changes in lifestyle are resulting in marked shifts in energy expenditure and growing rates of overweight, obesity, and risks for cardiovascular disease. Here we see some of those health consequences of the lifestyle transition among the Yakut. This graph shows changes in percent body fatness and the prevalence of overweight and obesity in the Yakut between 2003 and 2009. These changes closely parallel those documented by Rode and Shephard in Igloolik over 30 years ago. However, in contrast to the conditions in Igloolik in the early 1990s, our work suggests that the preservation of traditional activities and lifeways is still associated with greater levels of energy expenditure, activity, and better health. Here we see the results of Josh Snodgrass's work looking at the influence of subsistence participation on total energy expenditure and physical activity levels. Note that greater participation in subsistence activities from low to high is associated with significantly higher levels of energy expenditure and greater physical activity. In contrast, those individuals who are more integrated into the market economy with little or no involvement in traditional activities had the most sedentary lifeways. Additionally, work by Stephanie Levy has shown that greater involvement in subsistence tasks among Yakut adults is associated with significantly less weight and fat gain and substantially and significantly better measures of lipids, systolic, and diastolic blood pressure. To summarize, the extraordinary work of Roy Shephard and his colleagues among the Inuit of Igloolik provided the field of human biology with foundational insights into how human populations adapt to Arctic climates, and as well with insights into how the transition to a market-oriented lifestyle affects fitness and metabolic health. Our work in Siberia has confirmed and expanded upon Shephard's findings, noting that across circumpolar populations, we find significant elevations in basal energy expenditure, shared across the circumpolar region, and as well, finding that high levels of energy expenditure and physical activity are central to adaptations to the Arctic. In Siberia, we are also seeing, as in Igloolik, the trends of declining cardiometabolic health associated with the adoption of a more sedentary lifeway. Together, the work in Igloolik and in Siberia highlights the need for developing culturally specific strategies for promoting health in different populations. Today, I am encouraged by the thoughtful and rigorous work being carried out by human biologists to understand and address the health challenges of circumpolar populations. I see this as a very fitting tribute to the foundational work of Professor Roy Shephard. Thank you very much.